This week we are going to talk about the Progressive Era, which spanned from 1896 to 1916. This was a period of widespread social activism and political reform across the United States. So we're going to start off this lecture with a quote from Jack London from The Iron Heel, which was published in 1908. So you might be familiar with Jack London. He was a pretty famous American author. He was born in 1876 in California, and he's most famous for writing Call of the Wild and White Fang. So Jack London said that never in the history of the world was society in so terrific flux as it is right now. The swift changes in our industrial system are causing equally swift changes in our religious, political, and social structures. An unseen and fearful revolution is taking place in the fiber and structure of society. One can only dimly feel these things, but they are in the air now, today. So it was very apparent during the early 1900s that change was going to happen in pretty much every aspect of American life, from religious to political to social structures. Change was going on. So we have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911. So the reason why this was such a pivotal moment in the Progressive Era was because during this factory fire, the doors had been chained shut to prevent employees from taking unauthorized breaks. So that just shows you how controlling employers were during the early 1900s. As a result, the women who worked there were not able to leave because the doors were chained shut, so they had to figure out other ways out of the building, which resulted a lot of them jumping from either windows or going to the roof and trying to jump off the building to save themselves. As a result, 71 workers were injured and 146 had died. A year before this factory fire, the workers had gone on strike, demanding better working conditions, like better safety, better pay. And so this convinced many Americans for the need for reform, because this event definitely could have been prevented. So there was also reform through literature. So these are three major books which were written during this time period. The first one is How the Other Half Lives. And this was an interesting book because the author documented the squalor and poverty that was rampant in larger cities through photography. And that seeing images of how poor people lived really impacted a lot of society, and it led to housing reform. So to try to get housing for people who were poor, people who were homeless. Then there is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So the point of The Jungle was to reveal the exploitation of labor in the meatpacking industry and kind of show how terrible meatpacking plants were. And through his book, the government passed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So the first two books are kind of pessimistic. They show kind of the dark side of society during this time. But Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy is showing a more optimistic view. So this is a book where a man falls asleep in Boston in 1877 and he wakes up in 2000. So all the problems that they were facing in the late 1800s, they have all gone away, and now there's social harmony and economic prosperity. So when people read this book, they liked the hopeful nature of the book, and so it encouraged them to kind of achieve that type of utopia, that type of society. So the impact of religion, this is where we get during this time period the pretty popular quote of "What would Jesus do?" So it was coined by Charles Sheldon, who was an American Congregationalist minister and leader of the social gospel movement. So the idea of what would Jesus do is essentially when you are in a situation, you don't know how to act, you don't know how to respond. You just have to think about, okay, if Jesus were in this situation, what would he do? And that's supposed to help you make a decision on how to act. So there were some issues with the social gospel movement and people who followed this movement. The major one was that they often ignored the plight of women, which kind of goes hand in hand with they refused to support women's suffrage. So weren't really on board with the idea of women having the right to vote. They were also silent on the plight of pretty much all minority groups, African Americans, Native Americans, and other oppressed minority groups. So they weren't really concerned for these groups of people that were oppressed. They were just kind of concerned with themselves. Okay, so now we have, this leads into the women's movement.
This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about women in the Progressive Era. My God, that is a fantastic hat. Wait, votes for women? So between Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and all those doughboys headed off to war, women in this period have sort of been footnoted, shockingly. Mr. Green, I'd never make a woman a footnote. She'd be the center of my world, my raison d'etre, my joie de vivre. Oh, me from the past. I'm reminded of why you got a C+ in French 3. Let me submit to you, me from the past, that your weird worship of women is a kind of misogyny because you're imagining women as these beautiful, fragile things that you can possess. It turns out that women are not things. They are people in precisely the same way that you are a person. And in the Progressive Era, they demanded to be seen as full citizens of the United States. In short, women don't exist to be your joie de vivre. They get to have their own joie de vivre. So it's tempting to limit ourselves to discussion of women getting the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment, but if we focus too much on the constitutional history, we're going to miss a lot. Some historians refer to the 30 years between 1890 and 1920 as the women's era, because it was in that time that women started to have greater economic and political opportunities. Women were also aided by legal changes, like getting the right to own property, control their wages, and make contracts and wills. By 1900, almost 5 million women worked for wages, mainly in domestic service or light manufacturing, like the garment industry. Women in America were always vital contributors to the economy as producers and consumers, and they always worked, whether for wages or taking care of children and the home. And as someone who has recently returned from paternity leave, let me tell you, that ain't no joke. And American women were also active as reformers, since, America became a thing. And those reform movements brought women into state and national politics before the dawn of the Progressive Era. Unfortunately, their greatest achievement, prohibition, was also our greatest national shame. No. Yeah, all right, okay. It's actually not in our top 5 national shames. But probably women's greatest influence indeed came through their membership and leadership in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU was founded in 1874, and by 1890 it had 150,000 members, making it the largest female organization in the United States. Under the leadership of Frances Willard, the WCTU embraced a broad reform agenda, like it included pushing for the right for women to vote. The feeling was that the best way to stop people from drinking was to pass local laws that made it harder to drink, and to do that, it would be very helpful if women could vote, because American men were a bunch of alcoholic scoundrels who darn well weren't going to vote to get rid of beer hoses. In 1895, Willard boldly declared, "A wider freedom is coming to the women of America. Too long has it been held that woman has no right to enter these movements. Politics is the place for women." But the role of women in politics did greatly expand during the Progressive Era. As in prior decades, many reformers were middle and upper class women, but the growing economy and the expansion of what might be called the upper middle class meant that there were more educational opportunities, and this growing group of college-educated women leaned in and became the leaders of new movements. Sorry, there was no way I was going to get through this without one lean in. I love that book. So as we've talked about before, the 1890s saw the dawning of the American mass consumer society, and many of the new products products made in the second wave of industrialization were aimed at women, especially labor-saving devices like washing machines. If you've ever had an infant, you might notice that they poop and barf on everything all the time. Like, I recently called a pediatrician and I was like, my 14-day-old daughter poops 15 times a day. And he was like, if anything, that seems low. So the washing machine is a real game changer. And many women realized that being the primary consumers who did the shopping for the home gave them powerful leverage to bring about change. Chief among these was Florence Kelley, a college-educated woman who, after participating in a number of progressive reform causes, came to head the National Consumers League. The league sponsored boycotts and shaped consumption patterns, encouraging consumers to buy products that were made without child, or what we would now call sweatshop labor, which at the time was often just known as labor. And there was also a subtle shift in gender roles as more and more women worked outside the home. African-American women continued to work primarily as domestic servants or in agriculture, and immigrant women mostly did low-paying factory labor. But for native-born white women, there were new opportunities, especially in office work. And this points to how technology created opportunities for women. Like, almost all the telephone operators in the U.S. were women. By 1920, office workers and telephone operators made up 25% of the female workforce, while domestic servants were only 15%. A union leader named Abraham Bisno remarked that working gave immigrant women a sense of independence. They acquired the right to personality, something alien to the highly patriarchal family structures of the old country. Of course, this also meant that young women were often in conflict with their parents, as a job brought more freedom, money, and perhaps, if they were lucky, a room of one's own. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? Please let it be Virginia Woolf. Please let it be Virginia Woolf. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document, I'm either right or I get shocked. All right, let's see what we got. The spirit of personal independence in the women of today is sure proof that a change has come. The radical change in the economic position of women is advancing upon us. The growing individualization of democratic life brings inevitable changes to our daughters as well as to our sons. One of its most noticeable features is the demand in women not only for their own money, but for their own work for the sake of personal expression. Few girls today fail to manifest some signs of the desire for individual expression. That's not Virginia Woolf. Stan, I'm going to be honest, I do not know the answer to this one. However, it has been Woodrow Wilson for the last 2 weeks. You wouldn't do that again to me, or would you? I'm going to guess Woodrow Wilson, final answer. Dang it! Charlotte Perkins Gilman in the book Women in Economics? What? The idea that having a job is valuable just for the independence that it brings and as a form of individual expression was pretty radical, as most women, and especially most men, were not comfortable with the idea that being a housewife was similar to being a servant to one's husband and children. But of course that changes when staying at home becomes one of many choices rather than your only available option. And then came birth control. Huzzah! Women who needed to work wanted a way to limit the number of pregnancies. Being pregnant and having a baby can make it difficult to hold down a job, and also babies are diaper-using, stuff-breaking consumption machines. They basically eat money, and we love them. But birth control advocates like Margaret Sanger and Emma Goldman also argued that women should be able to enjoy sex without having children. To which men said, women can enjoy sex? Believe it or not, that was seen as a pretty radical idea, and it led to changes in sexual behavior, including more overall scootily pooping. Goldman was arrested more than 40 times for sharing these dangerous ideas about female sexuality and birth control, and she was eventually deported. Sanger, who worked to educate working-class women about birth control, was sentenced to prison in 1916 for opening a clinic in Brooklyn that distributed contraceptive devices to poor immigrant women. The fight over birth control is important for at least 3 reasons. First, it put women into the forefront of debates about free speech in America. I mean, some of the most ardent advocates of birth control were also associated with the IWW and the Socialist Party. Secondly, birth control is also a public health issue, and many women during the Progressive era entered public life to bring about changes related to public health, leading the crusade against tuberculosis, the so-called white plague, and other diseases. Thirdly, it cut across class lines. Having or not having children is an issue for all women, regardless of whether they went to college, and the birth control movement brought upper, middle, and lower class women together in ways that other social movements never did. Another group of progressive women took up the role of addressing the problems of the poor and spearheaded the settlement house movement. The key figure here was Jane Addams. My God, there are still Adamses in American history? Oh, she spells it Addams Family Adams, not like Founding Fathers Adams. Anyway, she started the Hull House in Chicago in 1889. Settlement houses became the incubators of the new field of social work, a field in which women played a huge part, and Addams became became one of America's most important spokespeople for progressive ideas. And yet, in many places, while all of this was happening, women could not technically vote. But their increasing involvement in social movements at the turn of the 20th century led them to electoral politics. It's true that women were voting before the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Voting is a state issue, and in many Western states, women were granted the right to vote in the late 19th century. States could also grant women the right to run for office, which explains how the first Congresswoman, Jeannette Rankin, could vote against America's entry into World War I in 1917. That said, the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment is a big deal in American history. It's also a recent deal. Like, when my grandmothers were born, women could not vote in much of the United States. The amendment says that states cannot deny people the right to vote because they are women, which isn't as interesting as the political organization and activity that led to its passage. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The suffrage movement was extremely fragmented. There was a first wave of suffrage, exemplified by the women at Seneca Falls, and this metamorphosed into the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. Most of the leadership of NAWSA was made up of middle to upper class women, often involved in other progressive causes, who unfortunately sometimes represented the darker side of the suffrage movement, because these upper class progressives frequently used nativist arguments to make their claims for the right to vote. They argued that if the vote could be granted to ignorant immigrants, some of whom could barely speak English, then it should also be granted to native-born women. This isn't to say that the elitist arguments won the day, but they should be acknowledged. By the early 20th century, a new generation of college-educated activists had arrived on the scene, and many of these women were more radical than early suffrage supporters. They organized the National Women's Party, and under the leadership of Alice Paul, pushed for the vote using aggressive tactics that many of the early generation of women's rights advocates found unseemly. Paul had been studying in Britain between 1907 and 1910, where she saw the more militant women's rights activists at work. She adopted their tactics that included protests leading to imprisonment and loud denunciations of the patriarchy that would make Tumblr proud. And during World War I, she compared Wilson to the Kaiser, and Paul and her followers chained themselves to the White House fence. The activists then started a hunger strike during their 7-month prison sentence and had to be force-fed. Woodrow Wilson had half-heartedly endorsed women's suffrage in 1916, but the war split the movement further. Most suffrage organizations believed that wartime service would help women earn respect and equal rights, but other activists, like many progressives, opposed the war and regarded it as a potential threat to social reform. But in the end, the war did sort of end up helping the cause. Patriotic support of the war by women, especially their service working in wartime industries, convinced many that it was just wrong to deny them the right to vote. And the mistreatment of Alice Paul and other women in prison for their cause created outrage that further pushed the Wilson administration to support enfranchising women. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So women's long fight to gain the right to vote ended with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But in some ways, the final granting of the franchise was a bit anticlimactic. For one thing, it was overshadowed by the 18th Amendment, prohibition, which affected both women and men in large numbers. Also Gatsby's. You can say a lot of bad things about prohibition, and I have, but the crusade against alcohol did galvanize and politicize many women, and organizations such as the WCTU and the Anti-Saloon League introduced yet more to political activism. But while the passage of the 19th Amendment was a huge victory, Alice Paul and the National Women's Party were unable to muster the same support for an equal rights amendment. Paul believed that women needed equal access to education and employment opportunities, and here they came into contact with other women's groups, especially the League of Women Voters and the Women's Trade Union League, which opposed the ERA, fearing that equal rights would mean an unraveling of hard-won benefits like mothers' pensions and laws limiting women's hours of labor. So the ERA failed, and then another proposed amendment that would have given Congress the power to limit child labor won ratification in only 6 states. You go, America. So in many ways, the period between 1890 and 1920, which roughly corresponds to the Progressive Era, was the high tide of women's rights and political activism. It culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment, but the right to vote didn't lead to significant legislation that actually improved the lives of women, at least not for a while. Nor were there immediate changes in the roles that women were expected to play in the social order as wives and mothers. Still, women were able to increase their autonomy and freedom in the burgeoning consumer marketplace. But it's important to note that, like other oppressed populations in American history, women weren't given these rights. They had to fight for the rights that were said to be inalienable. And we are all better off for their fight and for their victory. Women's liberation is, to be sure, a complicated phrase, and it will take a new turn in the Roaring '20s, which we'll talk about next week. I'll see you then. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. Our script supervisor is Mary.
So hopefully that gives you a pretty good overview of what was going on with the women's movement during the Progressive era. Okay, so here is a political cartoon of the women's suffrage movement. So here we see a woman dressed as votes for women, and all of the white states, like in the West, those are the ones that have already passed women's suffrage, and she's reaching out to all of the Midwestern and Eastern states, the states that have yet to pass suffrage for women. Okay, so here we see a group of women outside of the White House. This is when Woodrow Wilson was president, asking how long must women wait for liberty, and asking him what he will do for women's suffrage. And we see that they are wearing sashes, and they are wearing the sashes of the colleges that they attended. Okay, so the women's movement and the temperance movement kind of go hand in hand. So with the temperance movement, this is the idea of trying to limit the sale and consumption of alcohol. And so we have two major figures, Frances Willard and Carrie A. Nation. So they went about with the temperance movement in two different ways. Willard was more peaceful. So she was born in 1839 in New York, and she was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was elected in 1879, and she served in that role until her death in 1898. So then we have Carrie Nation on the right, and you see that she has an axe in her hand. So she was born in 1864 in Virginia. So Carrie Nation, the reason why she has an axe in her hand is because she often went around to different bars and which were serving alcohol, and kind of just started smashing stuff up. So she kind of took the more violent route to the temperance movement. But she was born actually in 1846 in Kentucky, and she passed away in 1911. Okay, so we talked about Jane Addams before, but we're going to look at her again a little bit more extensively, and what she did with settlement houses, specifically with the Hull House.
Jane Addams was a soft-spoken woman from a prosperous family. In 1889, she established the nation's first settlement house in a poor Chicago neighborhood. In doing so, she launched a philanthropic movement that continues to this day. Addams and other settlement house founders lived in the houses they founded. They taught English, provided childcare for working mothers, and counseled poor immigrants who were struggling to adapt to city life in a new country.
The idea behind the settlement house was it was not a charity, which was a big departure from previous work by middle-class white women, very much like Jane Addams' mother's generation. People who started settlement houses thought of the people surrounding them as their neighbors, not as their beneficiaries.
The slogan was neighboring with the poor. That is, instead of this noblesse oblige approach to philanthropy where people with money would go down to poor neighborhoods and sort of tell people what to do, the settlement workers decided to live in the neighborhoods of the people they were seeking to help.
Jane Addams grew up in rural Illinois. Her mother died when she was 2, and she was brought up by her father, a prosperous businessman with strong Quaker values.
When she graduated from college, she was part of this group of women born in the 1860s and 70s who were called New Women, who were college educated, and at the same time, didn't really have careers to go into.
So Addams made her career helping others. She began by acquiring a decaying mansion called Hull House in a neighborhood mainly populated by poor immigrants.
They'd come to the United States really with nothing, and had moved into conditions that were so different from the mostly rural areas that they were used to.
Hull House offered neighborhood residents an art gallery, coffee house, gym, public kitchen, and a music school. But Adams realized these social and cultural services had to be supplemented by political activism to truly help the poor. She worked to improve education and workplace conditions.
So the settlement house saw itself as advocating for social change.
In 1893, Adams, her activist friend Florence Kelley, and a number of other reformers in Chicago successfully pressed for a law that protected sweatshop workers and banned child labor in Illinois. Adams' reform work earned her the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. Her success inspired other middle-class, college-educated women to found hundreds of settlement houses across the nation. Their work laid the foundation for the professional field of social work in the United States.
Okay, so next we're going to look at women and business. So this is a picture of Maggie Walker. So Maggie Walker is an important historical figure who is oftentimes overlooked, but she was born in 1864 in Virginia. She was a businesswoman and teacher, and the reason why she is so important is because she was the first woman to own a bank in the United States. Okay, so this is at a time, like we saw with the videos, that women are trying to kind of find their place in society, trying to get more freedom for themselves. So the fact that a woman was able to own her own bank during this period is a huge step for women's economic freedom. Okay, so that kind of leads us into trust. So a huge part of the reform during this period was targeting the trust. So trusts were merged companies or companies that merged together, and their whole goal was to eliminate competition. Now, a lot of Americans were concerned about this because if there's no competition, if it's just one company and they're the only people that sell a certain product, they can charge whatever they want for that product. And it kind of gives them too much power and leaves the consumers with very little power or say. So this is a quote from Crowley. He was an intellectual leader of the progressive movement. He was also an editor, political philosopher, and co-founder of a magazine called The New Republic. So he said that the corrupt politician has usurped too much of the power which should be exercised by the people. The millionaire and the trust have appropriated too many of the economic opportunities formerly enjoyed by the people. So once again, the whole sentiment behind this is just taking power away from businesses and giving more economic freedom to the consumer. So here's a picture of Standard Oil and how it was viewed at the time. We talked about this a little bit before with John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil. So here we see Standard Oil as this monster who is essentially taking over every aspect of America. We even see it reaching past America. So we see it taking over the government. We see it taking over businessmen. We see it taking over the ships. So it's just kind of having way too much power. So here's this cool video of John D. Rockefeller. So it's pretty cool just showing you what he did, or obviously when he was a little bit older. But John D. Rockefeller was often viewed as kind of an evil figure by Americans during this time. Once again, mostly because they felt like he had too much power and he was taking power away from consumers. So we have Andrew Carnegie. He was similar to Rockefeller and Standard Oil with the idea of it being a trust, but people were kind of more forgiving of Andrew Carnegie just because of, and his company of Carnegie Steel, because of how much money he gave back. So Carnegie was a philanthropist, which meant that he just gave a bunch of money back to society and different groups to try to help move along the reform in America. So there was a big movement in regulating these trusts. So here are a few different laws that we'll just go over pretty quickly just so that you know what they are. So once again, just trying to regulate the trust to take away power from these companies. So the Granger laws were state laws that were passed in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and they regulated the fees that elevator companies and railroads charge farmers to store and transport their crops. Okay, so this really helped farmers out a lot to make sure that they weren't being overcharged for storing their crops. Okay, because that obviously can get expensive. Then we have the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, and this was designed to regulate the railroad industry. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 aimed to limit anti-competitive practices such as those institutionalized in cartels and monopolistic corporations. So essentially just trying to make sure that, trying to break down the trust, because once again, trusts were companies that, they merged together to create kind of like one super company, which eliminated competition. So just making sure that that doesn't happen anymore. Because in a capitalistic society like America is, we have a capitalistic economy, we need competition. So then the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 regulated mergers and price discrimination and protected labor's access to collective bargaining and related strategies of picketing, boycotting, and protesting. So this was just allowing workers that if they were upset and with how they were being treated by their employer, they were allowed to do things like protest and show that they were unhappy about it. So during this time, there was a lot that was harming the environment. So first of all, we talked about a little bit when we talked about the West was bison hunting. So bison were being overhunted, which depleted this resource. Logging companies, so these were companies that were tearing down trees. So they were doing it at such a fast rate that it was really hurting the environment. And then we also have chemical plants. And these chemical plants were releasing chemicals into the water, which is obviously not great. So here we have the Hetch Hetchy Valley before and after. So the reason why this is a before and after is it's just showing the effects of what happened after a dam was put up. So people that lived in this area, and this is near San Francisco, they were upset or kind of concerned about how poorly this valley looked and how poorly it was doing. So in 1913, Congress approved a project to build a dam in this valley, which overall benefited the citizens of San Francisco because it allowed them to have a little bit more energy and power from the dam. So preservation versus conservation. So this was huge during the Progressive era. So the difference between preservation and conservation. So preservation is this idea of having an escape from industrial way of life and a welcome change from the challenges of modernity. And that's different from conservation because conservation is more concerned with the monetary aspect. These were policies that benefited the nation's financial interest. So when we look at the Hetch Hetchy Valley, this is an example of conservation because it built a dam which provided financial interest to the government and to the citizens of San Francisco. Okay, so last major thing we're going to look at is Jim Crow and African American life. Okay, so we're watching a video about who was Jim Crow, why this is called the Jim Crow era.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Let's Teach channel, where we research interesting facts and share information on just about any topic. In a previous video, I talked about who Uncle Sam actually was. When you get a minute, check it out. In this video, I'll answer the question, who was Jim Crow? Let's get started. If you still remember your American history classes back in high school, then there's a good chance that you're familiar with the term Jim Crow. This referred to racial discrimination in the South, particularly to the set of discriminatory and repressive laws that were once enforced by the United States to restrict the rights of black people. Among these many policies were the segregation of schools and public areas to keep the coloreds and the whites from mixing with each other. Interracial marriages and cohabitation were also prohibited, with the former declared null and void in states like Georgia and Arizona. These laws have been largely eradicated, but Jim Crow continues to be used today, describing the systemic segregation and racial discrimination still experienced by black people in the South. While the term is closely associated with the South, its roots aren't actually Southern. In fact, we can thank the North for popularizing Jim Crow. So here are the origins of Jim Crow. In the early 1830s, a white actor named Thomas Dartmouth Rice, a native of New York City, began performing a theater act called Jumping Jim Crow, or Jump Jim Crow, which involved him painting his entire face black before proceeding to sing and dance in a way that he claimed had been inspired by a black slave. He would put on not only blackface makeup, but the shabby dress that imitated in his mind and in white people's mind of the time, the dress and aspect and demeanor of the Southern enslaved black person, says Eric Lott, the author of Love and Theft, Blackface Minstrelsy, and the American Working Class. At that time, caricaturing the physical characteristics of black people were popularized acts in minstrel shows, with working class whites vying for a front row seat to a spectacle that endlessly poked fun at the coloreds. Because of this, Rice's routine was a huge hit and quickly spread throughout the North, even going as far as England. He began touring different parts of the United States, performing the same act to crowds that steadily began to increase with each new show. As expected, Rice's popularity meant that his stage name slowly seeped into popular culture, and before long, it was being used to refer to black slaves in the country. In 1852, it was even written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in her timeless classic, Uncle Tom's Cabin, where one of the characters refers to another as Jim Crow. The ubiquity of Rice's minstrelsy routine eventually paved the way to Jim Crow becoming a derogatory term for black people, reducing them to the caricature that he played on stage. They were no longer seen as individuals with rights and emotions. Instead, they were merely a cartoonish version of a human being, something to be humiliated and laughed at. After the Civil War, many Southern states began to enforce laws that served to discriminate against the newly freed African Americans. And by the 1890s, these had gained the nickname Jim Crow Law. Here's a quote from back then. Travelers on the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad during the present months have noted the drawing of the color line in the passenger coaches. Captain Tilley is unceasing in his efforts to see that the color line, otherwise the Jim Crow Law, is literally and fearfully enforced. That's from an article in the Goldsboro Daily Argus in 1899 titled, How Captain Tilley of the A&NC Road Enforces the Jim Crow Law. Jim Crow began as an innocuous stage performance, a source of entertainment for working-class white Americans seeking a few laughs after a rough day of backbreaking labor. However, the term ended as a set of laws that did nothing but dehumanize an entire race, wholly integrating itself into the country's systems and whose ramifications can still be felt today. What are your thoughts on the topic? Do you have any?
Okay, so that kind of leads us into the 15th Amendment, I'll just show you a quick video just to refresh what the 15th Amendment was.
Hi, I'm Uhuru Williams. I'm a professor of history, and here's what you need to know to sound smart about the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is the last of the so-called Civil War amendments, beginning with the 13th Amendment in 1865 and ending with the 15th Amendment in 1870. The three Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, all sought in their own ways to ensure equality for African Americans in the South after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted African Americans citizenship. The 15th Amendment outlawed discrimination in voting rights. Contrary to popular belief, the 15th Amendment does not grant the right to vote to anyone. It simply outlaws discrimination in voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress failed to provide enforcement for the amendment originally. Enforcement did not come until 1870 with the passage of the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Interestingly, the first state to ratify the 15th Amendment was Nevada in March of 1869. The last state to ratify the amendment, Tennessee, in 1997. Although formally ratified in February of 1870, African Americans were still denied the right to vote by a variety of means by Southern states. These included things like the poll tax and literacy test. It would not be until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the majority of African Americans in the South were allowed to register to vote. Young people in large numbers came out and joined what became known as the Red Guards.
So if the 15th Amendment passed, then why was it so difficult for Black Americans to vote? So we have already talked about the poll tax and the literacy test, but I'll just go over that again, just real quick. So remember that the poll tax was a tax that was passed that people had to pay in order to vote. So now when you go to vote, there is no poll tax, it's free. But back then, to try to discourage Black Americans from voting, they required that they pay some type of tax before they were able to vote. There's also the literacy test, which a literacy test said that in order to vote, you had to pass some type of test saying that you were able to read and write. So for Black Americans, they generally made the test more difficult than for white Americans. So Black Americans might have to recite part of the Constitution or write a really lengthy paragraph, whereas white Americans might just have to write their name and they were considered literate. Okay, so the last one is the grandfather clause. And so the grandfather clause essentially stated that if your grandfather had voted before a specific period of time, which was technically before the 15th Amendment passed, then you didn't have to pay a poll tax or a literacy test. You could go in and vote if your grandfather voted. So obviously this discriminated against Black Americans because the time period that they were given, the 15th Amendment hadn't passed yet, so none of their grandfathers would have been able to vote. So therefore, Black Americans would have had to either pay a poll tax, do a literacy test, or both. Okay, so a pretty important court case during this time was Plessy versus Ferguson.
After the Civil War, the United States embarked on an era of Reconstruction, during which the country grappled with the painful history of slavery. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution sought to eradicate the taint of slavery by outlawing it and guaranteeing Black citizens equal treatment under the law and the right to vote. However, there was a lot of resistance to racial equality, particularly in the South. By the 1870s, Reconstruction had fizzled out, giving way to the Jim Crow era. Named after the minstrel show Jump Jim Crow, this period was defined by racial segregation laws passed by Southern states. Plessy versus Ferguson is the now infamous case in which the United States Supreme Court declared it constitutional for races to be kept separate. In 1892, Homer Plessy took a trip. He bought a first-class ticket, got onto the train, and settled in one of the coaches. The conductor told Plessy to move to a different coach, but he refused. So Plessy was thrown off the train and into a jail cell. Under an 1890 state law, railways within Louisiana were required to have, quote, equal but separate, unquote, coaches for Black and white passengers. Anyone refusing to sit in the assigned coach could be fined $25 or imprisoned for up to 20 days. As a U.S. citizen who was 7/8 white and 1/8 Black, Plessy argued that he was white and deserved to sit in the coach reserved for white passengers. However, under Louisiana law, Plessy was considered black. So Plessy was put on trial in state court for breaking the law by sitting in the wrong coach. At trial, Plessy argued that the law was unconstitutional, but the government disagreed. Judge Ferguson sided with the government. If convicted, Plessy would be sentenced to prison and charged a fine. Plessy asked the Louisiana Supreme Court to issue a writ of prohibition against Judge Ferguson to prevent him from enforcing the law. But the Louisiana Supreme Court found the law constitutional. So Plessy asked for a writ of error from the United States Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court reviewed the case to determine whether the Louisiana law requiring racially segregated railway coaches was constitutional. Writing for the majority, Justice Brown concluded that the law didn't violate the 14th Amendment. The amendment was designed to make everyone equal under the law, but it wasn't intended to eliminate distinctions based on race. The majority thought that political equality of the races wasn't compromised by segregation. State laws creating racially segregated facilities thus didn't violate the Equal Protection Clause if those facilities were, quote, separate but equal, unquote. Laws requiring segregation could be legitimate exercises of state police power, provided they were reasonable and based on good faith rather than racist motives. Here, Louisiana was simply respecting the fact that the two races preferred remaining segregated. In other words, it wasn't the law's job or even within the law's power to force the races to mix. The court also found that the 13th Amendment, which Plessy argued was violated by the Louisiana law, was a non-issue because the case had nothing to do with abolishing slavery or involuntary servitude. Therefore, the court affirmed the Louisiana Supreme Court's decision. In a powerful dissent, Justice Harlan found that the Louisiana law was discriminatory because it sought to keep black passengers from coaches reserved for white passengers. Harlan stated that the law was clearly intended to keep black people away from white people. This was a violation of civil rights. Harlan said the Constitution is colorblind, and so a state couldn't constitutionally deprive citizens of their rights based on their races. For Justice Harlan, the majority's decision was like the Supreme Court's infamous self-inflicted wound in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Harlan thought Plessy would foster animosity and basically predicted that it would be overturned. Harlan would have found the Louisiana law unconstitutional. It's worth noting, however, that as progressive as Justice Harlan's views were, he didn't believe in equal rights for all mankind. His dissent distinguished Chinese people, and he didn't quibble with the exclusion of the Chinese race from citizenship. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy versus Ferguson justified racial discrimination in the United States based on the separate but equal doctrine. In 1954, Plessy was finally overturned by Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka.
So Plessy versus Ferguson was an important court case because this is where we get the idea of separate but equal. And like the video said, it will be overturned in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. So the video talked about Justice John Harlan. So he's really important in this case, even though, so he was not with the majority. He was called the Great Dissenter, which meant that he disagreed with what the majority was saying. So he said, our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens in respect of civil rights. All citizens are equal before the law. So he believed that the Plessy versus Ferguson outcome was incorrect, and that it was a violation of civil rights to discriminate against someone on the basis of race, but most of his fellow justices did not agree with him. Okay, so another important figure during this time was Ida B. Wells.
In March of 1892, 3 black grocery store owners in Memphis, Tennessee were murdered by a mob of white men. Lynchings like these were happening all over the American South, often without any subsequent legal investigation or consequences for the murderers. But this time, a young journalist and friend of the victims set out to expose the truth about these killings Her reports would shock the nation and launch her career as an investigative journalist, civic leader, and civil rights advocate. Her name was Ida B. Wells. Ida Bell Wells was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi on July 16, 1862, several months before the Emancipation Proclamation released her and her family. After losing both parents and a brother to yellow fever at the age of 16, she supported her 5 remaining siblings by working as a school teacher in Memphis, Tennessee. During this time, she began working as a journalist. Writing under the pen name Iola, by the early 1890s, she gained a reputation as a clear voice against racial injustice and became co-owner and editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper. She had no shortage of material. In the decades following the Civil War, Southern whites attempted to reassert their power by committing crimes against Black people, including suppressing their votes, vandalizing their businesses, and even murdering them. After the murder of her friends, Wells launched an investigation into lynching. She analyzed specific cases through newspaper reports and police records, and interviewed people who had lost friends and family to lynch mobs. She risked her life to get this information. As a Black person investigating racially motivated murders, she enraged many of the same Southern white men involved in lynchings. Her bravery paid off. Most whites had claimed and subsequently reported that lynchings were responses to criminal acts by Black people. But that was not usually the case. Through her research, Wells showed that these murders were actually a deliberate, brutal tactic to control or punish Black people who competed with whites. Her friends, for example, had been lynched when their grocery store became popular enough to divert business from a white competitor. Wells published her findings in 1892. In response, a white mob destroyed her newspaper presses. She was out of town when they struck, but they threatened to kill her if she ever returned to Memphis. So she traveled to New York, where that same year she republished her research in a pamphlet titled Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. In 1895, after settling in Chicago, she built on Southern Horrors in a longer piece called The Red Record. Her careful documentation of the horrors of lynching and impassioned public speeches drew international attention. Wells used her newfound fame to amplify her message. She traveled to Europe, where she rallied European outrage against racial violence in the American South, in hopes that the U.S. government and public would follow their example. Back in the U.S., she didn't hesitate to confront powerful organizations, fighting the segregationist policies of the YMCA and leading a delegation to the White House to protest discriminatory workplace practices. She did all of this while disenfranchised herself. Women didn't win the right to vote until Wells was in her late 50s, and even then, the vote was primarily extended to white women only. Wells was a key player in the battle for voting inclusion, starting a Black women's suffrage organization in Chicago. But in spite of her deep commitment to women's rights, she clashed with white leaders of the movement. During a march for women's suffrage in Washington, D.C., she ignored the organizers' attempt to placate Southern bigotry by placing Black women in the back and marched up front alongside the white women. She also chafed with other civil rights leaders who saw her as a dangerous radical. She insisted on airing, in full detail, the atrocities taking place in the South, while others thought doing so would be counterproductive to negotiations with white politicians. Although she participated in the founding of the NAACP, she was soon sidelined from the organization. Wells' unwillingness to compromise any aspect of her vision of justice shined a light on the weak points of the various rights movements and ultimately made them stronger, but also made it difficult for her to find a place within them. She was ahead of her time, waging a tireless struggle for equality and justice, decades before many had even begun to imagine it possible. If you were inspired by Ida B. Wells' fight for equality, check.
The last two figures we are going to look at in this time period, Washington and Du Bois. So Booker T. Washington was, so we're going to see how Washington's life and Du Bois' life are pretty different. They had different upbringing. So Washington was born into slavery. And he talks about his experience in his life growing up in Up From Slavery, which was published in 1901. So in his book, Up From Slavery, it's an autobiographical work. So it's his personal experience of being born a slave and then all of the obstacles that he faced growing up. and pretty much everything that he had to go through. He also established the Tuskegee Institute, which is a college in Alabama, and it is a historically black college. He's also famous for his Atlanta Compromise speech. So in his Atlanta Compromise speech, he believes that racial equality can be achieved through accommodation. So he believed in like not agitating or stirring the pot, but earning respect through hard work. So that's different from Du Bois' method. So Du Bois, we see the difference here. He was born a free man. He popularized this phrase of the Negro problem. So he identified that systemic racial and economic discrimination would be the major problem of the 20th century. So he was the first, he's noted for being the first Black American to receive a PhD at Harvard. And one of the works that he wrote, which is pretty well known, is The Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903. So The Souls of Black Folk is a collection of essays, and this is considered the cornerstone of African American literature. And it's important because it starts to incorporate this idea of sociology into understanding African American history. Okay. So the Progressive Era was important because it signaled a turning point, because essentially Americans were just kind of getting fed up with the inequality that they were facing in America. So they were willing to confront the problems that they were facing and try to come up with political solutions to those problems. So reformers sought to bring order to chaos, to bring efficiency to inefficiency, and to bring justice to injustice. So overall, we see this period of people fighting for justice, trying to make America a better place for everyone to live in. So the Progressive Era signaled a bursting of long simmering tensions and introduced new patterns in the relationship between American society, American culture, and American politics. So that's the end for this lecture, and next week we are going to talk about World War I.